Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and today I was delighted to be joined by James Montague. Today's episode is a part 2 of our podcast from a couple of weeks ago on the Newcastle takeover situation. Last time round we talked about Mike Ashley and the hypothetical situation with Newcastle's new owners, what we might expect to see from a club being taken over by a fund with an awful lot of financial backing. Today's episode focuses on that fund and the new potential owners. At the time of recording, the takeover has not been completed. We are expecting it to go through, but we don't know exactly when. So today, James Montague talked to me about Mohammed bin Salman, who is technically at the very top of the PIF fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, which is worth in the region of hundreds of billions of dollars. We also talk a little bit about Amanda Staveley, the Dubai-based deal maker who will be taking 10% of Newcastle along with her group PCP partners and will probably be in charge of the day-to-day running of the club. And finally, what this all means for Newcastle fans who have obviously been put in a very difficult ethical conflict. We released a video yesterday on the Tifo Football YouTube channel, a 15-minute long epic mega, all about the history of Mohammed bin Salman and everything you need to know about the prospective new owners of Newcastle United. So you can go and check that out. We recover some of that territory in this podcast, though, so it's not necessary to watch it if you haven't already. And James also wrote a piece about why Mohammed bin Salman and the PIF might like to buy Newcastle United. That was released on The Athletic over the weekend, and as part of it, it features an interview with Hatice Cengiz, the fiancée of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi-American journalist who was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul a couple of years ago, and who is at the centre of this story. So you can go and check that out, and to do so, if you're not a subscriber already, you can get a 90-day free trial by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo90. That's the numbers 90. Okay, without further ado, here's James Montague answering the first question I asked, which was, who are Newcastle's prospective new owners?
Well, I mean, this is the $64,000 question. Who are the owners, or prospective owners, I should say? I mean, what we know is that this is a deal that is fronted by Amanda Staveley, who is a kind of British deal maker, kind of class of person that's kind of quite common in the Gulf, but based in the UAE, was instrumental in the Sheikh Mansour deal that brought him to Manchester City. And so she'll have 10% if the reports are true. The Reuben brothers, property developers who have interests in the Northeast, will have 10%. And the Public Investment Fund, which is the biggest sovereign wealth vehicle of Saudi Arabia, a country that has the second biggest oil reserves in the world. And the chairman of that is Mohammed bin Salman, who is the crown prince. And I think it's probably quite right to say the controversial crown prince of Saudi Arabia. And he's a man who has kind of rocketed to power really after, being a kind of quite a marginal figure. I mean, he was young when he became deputy crown prince in 2015 when his father became king. So it was quite a kind of unlikely rise, but with the power he's acquired, he's shown himself to be extremely ruthless, a reformer in some respects in terms of loosening some of the very tight social restrictions that the Saudis live under, including the guardianship system, which means that women often couldn't get jobs or get a passport or leave the country or travel without the say-so of a male relative. Those have been eased, cinemas have returned, entertainment, concerts, women are allowed to go to football matches, women are allowed to drive, which is a huge thing that has been a kind of human rights organisations have really zeroed in on. But again, this is two sides of the same coin. On the other side, he's shown himself to be an extremely authoritarian leader who has been or leader, or kind of, effectively he controls most of the levers of the state, even though his father is actually king. He's quite elderly now, his father. But there's been a kind of whole host of transgressions which have really, I think, been connected to this deal, because it's very difficult to say that MBS, which is how he's known, is somehow someone kind of distant, not involved in this. I mean, he's directly involved in this. I mean, he is the chairman of this body. He is fastidious in his involvement in almost every aspect of the running of the state now and of the economy, and controlling the fund, which is $320 billion big, and will probably get a lot bigger.
But can I interrupt and ask, just because I don't actually know the answer to this question, and I think it pertains to what you're just talking about now. What is the hierarchy in Saudi Arabia in terms of leadership? Because Mohammed bin Salman is the crown prince, his father is the king. What is a crown prince? Is that just the person who's nominated to become the next king, so they have power while they're in waiting?
So it's a successor. The crown prince is the successor. Often you'll have a deputy crown prince. And when you have a geniocracy, I think somebody could have described it as, which you have, the Saudi system has been a system of old men passing down power between the sons of Ibn Saud. There are 36 sons, and each one of them, would have had multiple wives. There's competing branches of royals who all think they have greater legitimacy than the others in trying to get power. The higher up you are, the more power, the more access to wealth that you can get. So there are competing branches, and often the king will, announce his succession to try to kind of appease some of these competing branches of the family. And what Mohammed bin Salman did, he was actually made deputy crown prince in 2015, but then outmaneuvered the nominated crown prince, who was a long-time intelligence chief, head of Saudi intelligence, who hadn't been in the best of health, but had been very well liked in Washington. And even though he was only 30 when he was made deputy crown prince, MBS kind of quite skillfully maneuvered himself around his rival. And in fact, there's a story that's kind of relayed in the recent book by Ben Hubbard, the New York Times Beirut bureau chief, who's just written a book about MBS, about how the actual crown prince was effectively put under some kind of house arrest and kind of forced to hand over the reins, or the crown prince kind of role, to MBS. And ever since then, he's consolidated his power, consolidated his economic power. And a lot of that has involved, he's become an authoritarian. There is no democracy. And what happens with authoritarians, I think, in the 21st century is that they now have extremely powerful technology and extremely powerful tools to shape and mold public opinion, especially social media. And the Saudis have been very, very good at that, in drowning out opposition, any voices which, although there was freedom of speech has been difficult in Saudi Arabia, there was a level of pushback that a lot of people could do. And one case in point is the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who within the country at times could push the envelope. You never knew, there was a red line that you couldn't cross in terms of certain criticism, but there was a certain amount of freedom to discuss ideas, especially if you're a connected man. But those lines have all kind of disappeared now. And so, you've got the jailing of activists, many of whom have been involved in asking for the kind of reforms that Mohammed bin Salman has brought in. And you've had, probably in terms of loss of life, the biggest mistake or the biggest stain, I think, on MBS's copybook so far has been his pushing and leading the kind of war in Yemen. And so, these are all policies which, have had his imprimatur on, that he has led. And, of course, probably the biggest kind of issue when it comes to MBS has been the murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, which took place in October 2018, and it happened at the Saudi embassy in the Saudi consulate, in Istanbul, and it's something that has really damaged his and Saudi Arabia's reputation.
Well, let's tell the story of Jamal now and of that day, because it's something that you describe in the piece you wrote for The Athletic that came out over the weekend, as part of which you speak to Hatice Cengiz, who was his fiancée at the time, who was waiting outside the embassy for him. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, Jamal's story, in a way, is very representative of how Saudi Arabia has developed over the past few years. On the one hand, young people now have more freedoms than they've probably ever had, because it's a very conservative kingdom, and those reforms are being driven out of necessity, really, because, you know, it's a huge country in the Middle East that has 70% of its population effectively is kind of under 30. So, you know, on the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, you have someone like Jamal Khashoggi, who's a very famous journalist, under the patronage of various very high-ranking royal figures, who had, you know, at times been quite critical of the Saudi state, but in a kind of, you know, paternalistic way, that by, you know, giving this like advice, you know, and so, you know, he operated in this very kind of small area that you get in Saudi, when it comes to the Saudi discourse, where you can push back a little bit, but not too much, and knowing how you can do it. And he had the ear of the royal court. I mean, you know, he was a very influential figure. But as Mohammed bin Salman comes to power, and Khashoggi, in many ways, is doing what he's always done, and he's offering kind of advice about why that might not be a good idea. For instance, on Yemen, or, you know, starting up a kind of new conflict with Qatar in the Gulf blockade. But in this new era, which is a kind of authoritarianism in a way, that isn't accepted anymore. And so he is then criticised and attacked on social media, a lot of it being, you know, allegedly government, or certainly people close to MBS have been involved in setting up kind of troll farms effectively, and they get this reputation, this nickname called the Flies. So whenever you criticise Saudi Arabia, or you come onto Saudi government's radar, you are suddenly then inundated with thousands, tens of thousands of Twitter accounts that are activated to swarm around you. That's why they're called the Flies. And eventually it gets so bad that he feels that he has to leave Saudi Arabia, goes to the US, writes for the Washington Post, where he's now writing to a much wider audience in English, you know, criticising MBS. Now runs absolutely counter to the massive effort that MBS has gone to kind of woo Western governments and captains of industry and tech giants in the US. I mean, we have a situation where, you know, he comes to Britain and, you know, he is shaking hands with the Queen, and, you know, talks about reform in Saudi Arabia. And then he goes to America, and, you know, it's wall-to-wall billboards and magazines being printed about him. And, you know, he goes to I think he meets Branson, and I think he goes to Google, and he meets Tim Cook at Apple, you know, and these guys, like, we're going to invest in Saudi Arabia. This is the future. But then on the other hand, you have the fly in the ointment, which is Jamal Khashoggi, which is saying, actually, this guy, yes, there are some reforms here that are good, but he's stifling debate, and he's jailing activists, which is something that is absolutely counterproductive, and people need to know. And so he gets to the point where he meets Hatice, his fiance, at a conference in Istanbul. Very quickly they decide to get married, and when he goes to the Saudi consulate to pick up his papers, he's told to come back the next day. And when he comes back the next day, there's a 15-man assassination squad waiting for him. Hatice waits outside. He goes inside, but within 10 minutes he's been killed, either strangled or injected with chemicals, and then later most likely dismembered, and his body's never been found. And so this is something that straight away was very, very problematic for the Saudi government, and for MBS in particular, because the people who were involved in it were close allies of his inner circle. And so everybody went out of their way to say it wasn't him, it wasn't us. And then drip, it appears that the Turkish Secret Service may have been monitoring the embassy, the consulate, and had quite a bit of evidence. In fact, so much so that when the head of the CIA had a private briefing about it, I mean, they came out and effectively said that they believed that he likely ordered the killing, or at least ordered an operation against him. It was quite common at the time to arrest and repatriate kind of critics of the government. So whether they wanted to actually kill him or not but the fact is that they had people in that team that were people who had skills very specialist skills when it comes to kind of body disposal. So I guess there's probably a clue there. But yeah, eventually the Saudis had to admit that it did happen, that it was them, that it was rogue agents, and then the narrative changed to try to stop connecting it to MBS by saying he didn't order it and it was a rogue operation. But he said, I take responsibility for it because, I'm the boss. So it is a tawdry, despicable affair, to be honest. And it's amazing that we're talking about this when it comes to Newcastle United and a football club. But I think it is important that people know. I mean, they can take the information any way they want to take it, I suppose. But I think it's important to know that this is who is going to be in charge of your club. This isn't some diffident, faraway prince who's bored, got lots of money, wants to invest in football and for a little bit of the glory. It's not that. This is, purchasing a football club so that it is part of a very defined national strategy and a very concerted campaign to try to mould people's opinions about what Saudi Arabia is and who MBS is.
And those sort of strategies and concepts have been refined over the last decade or so. I think the concept of the idea of some faraway, very wealthy person who's a little bit bored and wants to invest in the glory of football was once the accepted logic for deals such as this, and perhaps that was the truth. But over the last 10 years or so, I think we've seen, and the people who have invested in football have seen what value it can bring to their strategies and their aims. Can you take us through some of the other or similar situations that we've been through? Manchester City comes to mind, PSG too.
Well, I mean, the big one, I think, really is Roman Abramovich, 2003, taking over Chelsea. That was exactly the narrative. That this is like a young guy, made a lot of money, very super rich, loves London, loves football, wants to buy a football club. But none of that actually made sense because he wasn't, a bored young guy. This is one of the canniest operators in the Russian economy and someone who's very closely aligned with Vladimir Putin. And a lot of it comes out in a court case later in that, it's clear that in many cases he is following certain policies when it comes to buying newspapers which are critical of the President Vladimir Putin, for instance. So this wasn't somebody who was just bored and wanted something to do. It was something, he bought it for a reason. And so his wealth obviously completely changed the amount of money you needed really to compete in the Premier League. And everybody, it starts a kind of arms race, as it was. 2008 is a really crucial date as well because you have Manchester City is bought by Sheikh Mansour. Again, this narrative kind of comes out that this is just, it's private wealth and this is just a prince who wants to do something, with his time. Again, he's one of the most important, powerful people within the UAE, within Abu Dhabi. He's not investing in it for profit, which is what he says in his one statement he makes to the press when he buys the club, which he says, this is a great investment. And, it might be a good investment. He might be able to sell, Manchester City for 4 billion, 3 billion, whatever, however much it's actually worth. But in reality, he's, the amount of money that's invested, the amount of time that's been invested in it, it's not an investment on the level that these guys usually operate at. And then you have PSG being taken over by a sovereign investment vehicle of Qatar. And these three purchases, if Saudi Arabia goes through, what is clear is that if you invest in a football club, you are able to change people's perceptions about your country and the story around your country. It softens it, absolutely. And Qatar and Dubai, which is another emirate in the UAE, were very, very early in adopting this kind of policy and using sports events, football teams, knowing that kind of televised sport in particular provides this huge billboard, the biggest billboard in the world, to try and normalize your country as a tourist destination, to popularize your national airline, to
let people know you exist as well, right?
Exactly. I mean, no one knew who Qatar was really until the 2000. If you'd asked anybody, where's Qatar? I mean, they probably wouldn't be able to spell it, let alone point it on the map. I mean, this has been a good thing and a bad thing. Winning the bid for the 2022 World Cup in 2010, has been a boon in terms of name recognition, but has also brought a hell of a lot of heat onto them. Manchester City is a different kettle of fish altogether, because if you see the people who are involved in the running of Manchester City, these are the people who are working at the highest level of government in Abu Dhabi, involved in foreign policy decisions, involved running multi-billion pound sovereign wealth vehicles. And when we recently saw the Der Spiegel leaks about what's been going on behind the scenes at City, where they're alleged to have tried to have got round financial fair play rules by, cooking the books when it comes to some sponsorship opportunities with other state-run companies in the UAE, especially. When you see that, you realise that people are using football in particular as a way to completely send a different message out to people, build a different narrative around what your country is. And it is a very effective thing. I mean, we look at Twitter, and often I get this from City fans and Newcastle fans, like, yeah, you say it's about changing reputation, but look at this, we're all talking about it, like everyone knows about it. Why would they do this? And I'd often say that, Twitter isn't the real world. If you ask most people outside of Twitter, I mean, we learnt that in the last general election, Twitter isn't the real world.
If you ask people in the areas of Manchester that have received, glorious regeneration as a result of money that's come from the club and from the club's owners, of course they're going to be delighted. And why shouldn't they be? I mean, that's where they live, right?
I mean, it's I think there is a very powerful kind of moral core here, which is that there is the north and working class areas in Britain have been absolutely left behind by successive governments and left behind by the wealth, which is kind of it has massively concentrated in the southeast of England, absolutely screwed over. But at the same time, whilst that is true, and I can see why people are happy with it, it has transferred who's getting screwed over, because actually, where does that money come from? Who builds the buildings in the UAE? I mean, the entire economy is built on an army of essentially of indentured slaves. So yeah, they may well have rebuilt East Manchester. Newcastle might have new high rises being built, but that's been built on the back of millions and millions of exploited workers. And I don't mean people not being paid the minimum wage. I mean people living in camps, under the kafala system, which we've heard a lot about with Qatar, but what we haven't heard a lot about is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are far worse. Saudi Arabia is by far the worst place to be if you're a worker, in terms of kind of the law, in terms of what redress you have. There's been some path to reform in Qatar because the World Cup, because they've been dragged to it. The UAE did have some kind of bit more enlightened policy, but that's changed as the nature of the UAE government has changed as well from really 2008, 2009 onwards. So, I can understand why people what they've done for us is good. They've brought us success. They've regenerated, but it isn't without a cost. And often the source of where that comes from, the morality of that is I think it's quite troubling. And again, it's something that I bring up with I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm not a United fan. I'm not a Sunderland fan. It's something that from studying this area, living there, and spending a lot of time in labour camps in Qatar and the UAE and visiting Saudi as well, is that I think it's a story that has to be brought into us. Because the other thing to bring in, of course, is that these three deals at PSG, Manchester City, and Saudi and Newcastle United, if it goes through, effectively puts the control of three clubs in the hands of states, of governments. And that can be quite a frightening thing. And it brings up all sorts of other issues about the integrity of the league. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting time. It's a fascinating story, but at the same time, it is, we shouldn't forget why they're buying these clubs. And it isn't because they love the area they're buying, and it isn't because they want to make a profit necessarily, although that'd be a nice auxiliary benefit. It's because they see at the various highest levels of power in those countries a benefit to them by owning and investing in these clubs.
Well, let's talk about this from a Newcastle fans' perspective now, and I'm keen to do this because I want to make a separation between two different groups. We'll come to that, right? The first thing to say is I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute, James, and if you can try to answer these questions that I've seen proposed by not just Newcastle fans, some Newcastle fans, some other people too. The UK has, I know that this was stopped by a UK court just at the end of last year, but the UK over the last 5-10 years has made billions of pounds selling arms and military equipment to Saudi Arabia, who, as you mentioned, have then used that on civilian populations in Yemen. So what right does anyone in the UK have to suggest that this deal shouldn't be going through as it relates to football, yet no one's really talking about that aspect of it with the UK? How would you respond to that sort of question?
Yeah, I have a massive sympathy for that, because I think that especially the British government, but the US government too, our relationship with Saudi Arabia is highly dysfunctional. And I think, again, this isn't something that's new to people. I mean, it might be new to people who, read, sports journalism, but this is something people have been campaigning against the arms trade to Saudi Arabia long before what happened recently in Yemen. Over the amount of executions that take place. I mean, last year, Saudi Arabia executed more people than it ever has in a single year. When it comes to the women's rights, all of these things, people have campaigned against them. But the hypocrisy of the British government, having any policy on human rights, and then at the same time allowing 15 billion pounds worth of BAE weapons to be sold to Saudi Arabia and then given air support whilst it bombs Yemen into the Stone Age it drives me mad, let alone Newcastle fans. I think it's absolutely right that they should bring up, well, what about this? The issue I would come to is that, yeah, but that isn't right either. The fact is that the British government has proven themselves to be conniving and to be, someone who doesn't really care about human rights at all unless it changes the bottom line. But that is wrong too. It's not like we've all said, oh yeah, that's great. And then Newcastle comes along and said, oh, and then we said, no, we've got to stop that. That isn't how it works. It's been, buying a football club is an extremely high profile thing. And so what you're finding is that a lot of activists who have been campaigning for years for this kind of thing, and let's not forget that a British court stopped us from selling arms to Saudi Arabia in September last year because of the humanitarian damage that was being done in Yemen and our complicity in it. And, the British government has fought tooth and nail and probably is getting around those some way. But that's awful. We should not be selling arms to Saudi Arabia. We should not be fueling that conflict. I think that whilst that kind of contradiction is there, it doesn't mean that by bringing this up, that the other stuff isn't bad as well. And so I don't really understand. I do understand it, but I think it's often a lot of the whataboutery that happens online, I think, is about trying to justify what's going to happen, because it's much harder to say, because a football club is your football club. It's not like your favorite brand of trainers is taken over by, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and then you can say, well, I'm going to stop buying those trainers. It doesn't work like that. You can't just kind of give up on your club. But at the same time, you have to be aware that this is who is involved in your club. And we are now talking about Newcastle United because that's what, my area of interest is in the super rich and football and politics in the Gulf. And so for me, I can see the contradiction in the kind of terrible way that the British have acted as a government. But at the same time, I think we do have to, realise that buying this club and running it in the way they're going to run it does produce huge moral issues that I think are really important. And I think, unfortunately, it's become so polarised, the debate, and it becomes then an issue about whether, bias, hypocrisy, and usually it's not bias or hypocrisy. No one's bringing these issues up because, they want another club to be bought, or because it's necessarily Newcastle. Newcastle is, probably everybody's favourite second, apart from in Sunderland, probably everybody's second favourite team. So it's got nothing to do with Newcastle. It's just this. There are huge moral issues about being bought by the state of Saudi Arabia. And I mean, you can choose not to ignore those, but ultimately every person has to come to an accommodation with that. And I think that usually the reporting around it has been pretty honest, been pretty fair. It's not being driven by animus or racism or hatred. It's being driven by, the facts on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say at this point as well, just to like the piece that you wrote for The Athletic, the script that you wrote for the Tifo video we've just released today, neither of those things are bias. And I've seen like one or two comments. The vast majority have been very very welcoming and grateful and have been complimentary. There are one or two sort of suggestions of bias. I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth, right?
Well, I mean, look, I guess they don't know that. I mean, maybe I am a secret Mackham. They wouldn't know. Maybe you wouldn't know. But I think there's so much hypocrisy out there that I think it's very difficult for people to believe that they're an honest broker on this. And I see the kind of abuse that other journalists get. I mean, I was Miguel Delaney from the Independent kind of retweeted the article, and so I kind of got a window into the kind of abuse that he gets, which is pretty like it would. I think it would affect someone's mental health to have that kind of streamed into your phone 24 hours a day, and a lot is brought up about the Independent being partly owned by Saudi Arabia, although that had been hidden for a long while. But the fact is that he's out there criticising the Saudi. If it is owned and controlled by the Saudi government, then he should be beefing up his security, because he's out there criticising them 24/7, 24 hours a day. And it's got, again, I don't think it's got anything to do with Newcastle. I think it's got to do with the fact that if these things matter at all, kind of the nature of the owner. If it's only about money and no one cares about the human rights aspect of it, then, fine, and we can just say that. But if it does matter in any way, then, we have to bring that to people's attention. I think it is important that we highlight those things.
Well, and that's the salient point, James, because I think another thing I would like to say here is I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from a certain strand of Newcastle fans about what is being said. That no one is certainly I don't think anyone with any credibility is writing pieces which are then suddenly saying, if you continue to support Newcastle after this, you're as bad as a terrorist. No one's saying that. Do you know what I mean? This is about telling the story. This is about raising awareness of the situation. This is about Newcastle fans who can continue to go and support their team after this has happened, knowing what the situation is, right?
Yeah, I mean, Newcastle fans feel attacked, and I think that by making human rights, front and centre, they feel like they're being forced to make a moral decision, which is almost impossible for them, because they're not going to stop watching their club, they're not going to stop loving their club. But if they have a new owner that gets rid of an owner they absolutely hate, then they are put as a football fan. So let's take everything else out of it. They're putting in, as a fan of Newcastle United, they're putting in an almost impossible situation, and that's when the resentment comes, and that's when you defend yourself when you're cornered. And that's what I found with many Newcastle fans. I mean, I like to think I tried to write with some integrity on this, and so I find that if you engage with people But there are people who don't want to listen to that and just say, what about this?
Well, this is why I wanted to separate the group into two. There are supporters, the vast majority, I would assume, who are interested to hear about this, who find themselves conflicted in that position that you just described, and are obviously keen to have the conversations, are willing to learn and willing to back down when they've got something wrong or pipe up when they've got something right. The second group are people who are going to bat for a new ownership that they presumably know very little about, or whether or not they do makes no difference. And the problem I have with that second group, who again perhaps perceive that they are being told they can no longer support the club they love, which certainly from my perspective is not happening. The problem I have with the second group is that they are an active part in the sports washing, as far as I see it. Like the new ownership, when situations like this occur and a football club is bought, one of the things that a new ownership knows it's going to get is an online army of people who are willing to go to bat for them all the time. And there's a difference between being conflicted, having a sort of feeling like you have a kind of moral confliction or a moral decision to make, and sitting somewhere in the middle. That's absolutely fine, completely understandable. And if that happened to my club, I'd be in exactly the same situation. The people who actively involve themselves in going to bat for the new ownership, that they're participating in sports washing. I mean, that is the sports washing.
I mean, I don't think that Manchester City realised they were going to get that benefit until it was clear that was a benefit, in that, football is about tribalism. Modern politics is about extreme tribalism. If we see how it's now operating in the UK when it comes to kind of Brexit, if you look at the US government and the rise of Trump, and you see the rise of illiberal democracies, basically it's about getting it's about almost creating the kind of tribalism that you'd expect in a sport as a football team. And I mean, I would say that there's been, again, we talk about Twitter, and social media isn't the real world. I mean, it's an important way of shaping how people view the real world. But what I found with a lot of the kind of, especially very critical voices that kind of, I'm not sure how representative they are actually of the match-going Newcastle United fan, because, when you see, I think there was the Supporters Trust did a poll on whether they supported it. Overwhelmingly, they did support the move. But I think that the number of people that replied that were, season ticket holders was actually quite a low proportion of people. And it's a huge club with a big fan base, so maybe that's to be expected. But what was, I think, very opened my mind a little bit more to this was when, Hatice Cengiz, her voice needed to be heard in this debate. I mean, one of the reasons why I thought it was important to interview her for the piece is that I went, she herself released a statement on Twitter, which was, the Premier League have got to stop this. I mean, this is a guy who essentially killed my fiance, or was complicit in it at the very least. And there were, a lot of Saudi voices obviously criticising her because she gets terrible abuse. And there were some Newcastle fans as well. But then there were also Newcastle fans, who were on there saying, this woman has lost her fiance. What are you doing? You're embarrassing our club. And for me, that was heartening, that it isn't monolithic what is happening at Newcastle, but it's, everybody is coming to terms, I think, somehow with how to deal with this. And it's a process. And, all you can do as a journalist is put the facts out there in as unbiased a way as possible, or as true as possible. I mean, again, bias. I mean, you can write about the human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, but I mean, and you can also write about the reforms, but you can't both sides Jamal Khashoggi. You can't both sides it. It's there, and it's a stain, and it's something that, will continue to be there, and something that's going to have to be dealt with if PAF, eventually do bankroll this and take it over the line.
Yeah, I don't think I have any more questions. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's the Premier League has been put in a almost impossible position, to be honest. This will come out, I think, later today, and the Premier League still hasn't made a decision on it. And I think it does have the power to potentially stop this, but it is an impossible position for them, because, if they make that decision, they are creating an absolute, diplomatic earthquake. So I don't in any way, I kind of feel sorry. It's difficult to feel sorry for Richard Masters, really, but the chief executive of the Premier League. But I do think that he's been put in an almost impossible position. There are all sorts of other issues, not just the human rights concerns. I think there is quite a big issue when it comes to the integrity of the competition, because Sheffield United is owned by a prince who's grandson of one of Ibn Saud's sons. So, somebody who is quite well connected with the royal family. But we've seen how within Saudi Arabia, and we're talking particularly about how hundreds of business people and billionaires and princes were brought to the Ritz-Carlton in 2017 and locked up until they effectively signed away a lot of their worth, which was apparently an anti-corruption drive. which, I think that at some level it was, but it was also, there's a handy benefit of that was that many people who were, might be potential rivals to power also dealt with. So when you see that is the power and the level and the kind of, that's how far the MBS is willing to go. How can you say that MBS does not have any kind of control over the owner of Sheffield United? I mean, it puts up, theoretically at least, all sorts of issues. And we've had one example of this, really. I think it was a couple of months ago when, UEFA announced that it was going to ban Manchester City from the Champions League because of its alleged cooking the books when it comes to kind of financial fair play based off the Der Spiegel leaks. And then the top 10 wrote to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, backing the move, calling for them to be banned, except for two clubs, Manchester City and Sheffield United. I mean, why would Sheffield United not want that to happen? I mean, on a purely competition basis, they've got a greater chance of being in the Champions League. But of course, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have a strong political bond. MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the Crown Prince and MBS's kind of mentor in the UAE, they have a very, very close partnership. So I think that offers a potential problematic element to this. And then you've got the fact that the Saudi state, as part of this blockade that's been taking place with Qatar, its neighbour, who they've fallen out with in recent years, and now there's a kind of air and land and trade blockade between all the countries, and an information war that's kind of broken out around it. There's been a kind of Saudi institution called Be Out Q, which is a kind of is bootlegging all of Be In Sports kind of Premier League and other intellectual property, and so that's an action that the English Premier League has been involved in as well. And I think that is problematic, that you allow, the sovereign wealth fund of a country where that level of piracy, most likely directed by state bodies, is taking place. So there are many, many ways that this could be stopped. But ultimately, this is politics at the very, very, very highest level. And so it won't be stopped, because if it is stopped, you're going to get conversations between MBS and Boris Johnson about pulling out investment as we're coming towards Brexit, officially, when we officially do go, supposedly on the 31st of December this year. So there's a bigger game at play. And going back to the original question, or one of the original questions, is when you have states involved in running clubs, it's state interests. It's the interests of the state that come first, not the interest of the club or the interest of the football. And that's the game that we're now playing because of the type of ownership that's been allowed to take over at clubs in the English Premier League, in the French League, in Italy, but especially in England. And I think that, it will go ahead, but I think it's going to cause many, many, many problems in the years to come.
And you know what? Whichever state it is, it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it was the US government bought a national team, and then this is something that keeps on coming up, like, oh yeah, well, where are you talking about? The Americans and Iraq, and I'm like, well, when the American state owns a football club in the Premier League, then I can guarantee you. I'm going to have to speak to you first, Joe, but I can guarantee we'll be doing a video about the kind of the million dead in Iraq because of the dodgy dossier. I can absolutely guarantee we'd be doing that. If it was, if it was anyone that has blood in their hands, and if it's a state, they have a long record. If it was the Danish state, I think it'd be a bit more problematic. I think that less problematic. I'm sorry, but it's not. It's countries that have a demonstrable poor human rights record, which I think it's becoming less important for people, but I think it should matter.
Yeah. Okay, listen, James, thanks so much for your time today and for your excellent work on the article and the video script.
Cheers, thank you.
And we will be back later in the week with something else. Thanks so much for listening. Au revoir.